Leslie's wealth arrived too fast and too dazzling, like a blaze kindled by sparks that had been gathering for years, making her believe it was a fated gift that Barbara had left behind, a belated reward for all the deficits in tenderness, a mark of recognition that the effort of building a life on her own would finally be acknowledged. But money is never innocent. It carries the path of signatures, covenants, conditions, and guarantees as fragile as a film of ice over a late winter lake, and the one who carefully laid that ice so the girl who might not even be hers could cross without falling was none other than Anita, the woman who used her reputation and even her private assets to underwrite a complex financial lattice of trusts, life insurance, note bonds, and tax exemptions tied to the cultural estate Barbara left. Anita must have known from the start that Leslie would not be easy to manage, that she burned with a rebellious heat and a native sense of justice that refused to cue, but that was precisely why she built a thicker frame and a tighter lock, to watch calmly as the girl climbed a stable dais, independent enough not to drown, bound enough not to shatter the order. When the safe groaned open, when the lawyers read the clauses, when the cold figures appeared in a new account, Leslie did not know that behind every formality were nights when Anita had bargained with fund managers, posted collateral from her own assets to secure the cash flow, and used committee relationships to legitimize the transfer of beneficiary rights that were shot through with narrow legal turns. She only saw herself suddenly standing where she had long wished to be, while Anita knew she had placed there an unseen debt of gratitude, a debt she did not expect to be repaid, only hoped would be strong enough to hold Leslie steady when the storm came. The storm did not arrive as planned. Leslie, who had never healed from the fine scratches left by the way Barbara departed, began reading documents and catching the whispers around Fairmont Crest with a caution that curdled into suspicion, suspicion into hypothesis, and hypothesis into conviction that Anita herself had shoved Barbara to the final edge. She read manipulation into every financial decision, read clauses as an indictment, treated the gift as a blade and wielded it against the only person who could have explained everything. Anita kept silent, the silence of a person who has chosen to be the submerged rock of a dam, knowing that yanking one stone will pull the river down with it, and knowing too that while feeling runs at its highest amplitude every explanation is only kindling. She endured media barrages, endured Leslie's sharp-toned appearances at community drives, endured being labeled a profiteer who hid behind a dead woman's estate, endured even Vernon's averted gaze when sugared bullets of hard questions ricocheted through the family's drawing room after each gala. And then, like shears that sever the last cord, that night in the Grand Salon turned into a gallery of disgrace when Anita pushed a sealed envelope across the table containing DNA results that declared Vernon was not Leslie's father. Vernon chose silence, a silence heavier than any denial, and Anita let coldness be her armor, forcing Leslie out under the weight of public judgment and humiliation. In that moment 100 hairline fractures appeared on the glass surface of the family's power, and Leslie understood she had just been shoved back from a gate she thought had opened. The collapse of faith births the need to prove. Leslie would not accept that her internal world could be broken by a few numbers on paper. She began gathering shards of memory about the times Barbara looked at her a heartbeat longer than usual, the half-sentences Peaches dropped in a cramped kitchen behind a street that only bustled on weekends, the blurred photographs of some summer party where Vernon stood at the edge of the frame and Barbara turned her face away. She called an old acquaintance who had worked at the lab where the sample was processed, not asking directly about the result but about the chain of custody, shift changes, the odds a file might be reflagged in highlighter. Each answer pushed her farther from safe ground. There were holes in the transfer chain, an odd after-hours call to the lab manager on the night the sample was registered, an electronic signature on the system from an account not on duty, and an invisible thread linking that lab to a charity under Anita's patronage. She had no smoking gun, but she had enough slices to picture the outline behind the curtain, where power could bend a result by nudging the placement of a checkmark. She filed for an independent audit of the funds she benefited from, reasoning that if Anita could meddle with DNA she could meddle with money. Auditors came with attorneys in tow, spreadsheets opened, internal transactions were traced, private guarantees and extension terms were dragged into light. At the end of the corridor lay not an embezzlement conspiracy but another picture entirely. Anita had used her own assets to plug legal gaps, had capped withdrawals, had guaranteed yields so grants would convert into steady flows for Leslie. She had not stolen. She had borne risk. And Leslie, who had used that money like a blade, began to recognize she was standing on tiles mortared by someone else's sacrifice. Seeing that truth did not mean backing down. Leslie's straight-through temperament drove her onto another plane, one where the shame of the Grand Salon and the fragments of tampered DNA could not be shelved as yesterday's weather. If those results were manipulated, who helped Anita hide the truth? The first name to drift through was Ted, the man who had a gift for showing up where knots were tightest and leaving them flat, a man whose every step left a fine dusting of handshake agreements never put in writing. Leslie traced consulting fees, the murky invoices of a data security outfit, emails with only subject lines and blank bodies sent at lunchtime as if the best secrets preferred the hour people spilled coffee across keyboards. She brushed Bill's Orbit, the influencer of community projects stapled to political campaigns, who spoke about ethics like a balanced equation but always left one variable free to swap at the buzzer. She found no written directives, but she saw uncanny overlaps between Anita's meetings with campaign committees and the moment the DNA chain of custody swerved. The fuzzy knots made every hypothesis chillingly plausible. Each step taught Leslie that this game was about more than bloodlines. It was about the self-defense of a larger power system where every truth must be weighed against political consequence. That thought made her want to pull someone close, and she thought of Peaches, who once laid a sunbrowned hand on her shoulder and said there were things Barbara had not had time to arrange. Peaches returned without fanfare, no horns, only a soft-folded canvas bag, inside it a leather-bound notebook, a rusted ring of keys, and a dark yellow envelope sealed with old tape. Peaches said Barbara had sent these in case things spun out of reach and told her to hand them to Leslie only when the girl was truly ready to see everything as it was. The notebook was no diary of feelings but a ledger of disbursements, appointments, calls, and private symbols Peaches knew how to read. There were notes about doctor visits, about an education fund for a child, about a rushed summer meeting with Vernon years ago, and about freezing a biological sample as a last insurance. The envelope contained a lock of old hair, a notarized slip, and a sentence in Barbara's hand short enough not to become a last will but clear enough not to be misread. None of it flipped instantly into answers, but it placed a lever in Leslie's palm, something that could reopen an independent test because now she had a comparison sample outside any chain controlled by the family. Peaches did not promise beauty in the truth. She said only that it must be looked at whole, including the slice that would hurt again. And Leslie, for the first time since the Grand Salon, felt the tilt in her chest ease, because she would not be walking alone through the maze of closed doors. As Leslie prepared the paperwork for an independent analysis and hired a forensic audit of the lab data, Anita launched a smear campaign guided by a cool doctrine of striking at Leslie's personal credibility. Local television interviews painted an ambitious girl exploiting public sympathy, op-eds by credentialed ethicists framed beneficiary duties and the line between entitlement and ingratitude, anonymous posts dredged up stale stains from years when Leslie stumbled at society's edge. The approach worked short-term, because the public prefers the simple tale that sudden wealth makes people forget their roots, but it also forced Anita into her own mirror, where new fatigue lines had formed at her eyes. She knew she was defending what she believed to be the right order, yet she also began to dread the day the dam she built would fissure where she could not see. Vernon stood between them like a street lamp in a blackout, there yet shedding no light. He was torn between protecting his reputation and the slow ache of an old secret he had buried so long he sometimes forgot its shape. His career was climbing toward a critical rung, and every motion now had to be priced against chain reactions. Silence became strategy, a screen that seemed sturdy yet proved more brittle than a half-confession. The political gala arrived like an exam no one could skip. The hall was full of people long practiced in the clink of glass, timely laughter, and speeches warmed to the precise degree. Leslie chose not to hide. She entered without pausing for anyone, carrying nothing but a sharpened resolve. The confrontation required no words, because everything that needed transmitting could travel through posture, through an unbowed spine, through eyes that no longer wanted to weep. She stood before Vernon, demanding neither acknowledgement nor denial, merely allowing his silence to exhibit its true contour to all. That silence was enough for the politically attuned to see a curtain quiver. Donors grew cautious, partners asked for clarifications, the family empire disclosed fractures only audible to those already inside the house. For the first time Anita felt control sliding when she realized the room no longer hewed to her narrative. She still stood, but for a flicker the old losses and anxious midnights returned to demand an accounting. Behind the stage aides whispered, the press prodded, and the machine misfired as if a gear had worn bare. The independent result did not land on gala night, but it landed soon enough that no one could erect a new wall. The conclusion showed the prior chain bore signs of metadata interference, timestamps imperfectly aligned with machine logs, and a sample that carried a contaminant consistent with repeated off-protocol decoding runs. More importantly, comparison with the material Peaches supplied yielded a genetic structure suggesting a high probability of relation to Vernon, insufficient for a courtroom decree at once but sufficient to expose DNA as a tool weaponized. Leslie touched that truth without triumph, with a tired relief, because she was not as unhinged as they said, and Barbara, through neat notations, had not left her stranded in a script pre-written end to end. Yet when she turned toward the money, the state's audit closed with a cold sentence. Most of the privileges she enjoyed were contingent on guarantees and clauses Anita had activated, and her use of those funds to attack their guarantor violated ethical covenants attached to the trust, triggering a suspension of her beneficiary status and shifting a portion of assets into community oversight. In a single day, Leslie lost nearly everything that could be counted. She left a newly leased house, returned a car, halted the charitable initiatives she had launched as promises to herself. But the loss did not come alone. It brought a strange hollow in which new bricks might be set. Anita stood on the fallow ground of a hollow victory and recalculated. She had protected the trust's architecture and its legal bindings, but she had not preserved the warmth once held by the community, and she certainly had not preserved something cracking inside herself. She had safeguarded Barbara's estate in the most literal sense of paperwork, yet the very shell she built had warped what Barbara truly wanted to leave behind, the chance for Leslie to know the whole truth and choose. Vernon sagged into the quiet of his office, staring at an old photograph of Barbara beneath a summer sky, realizing his silence had shielded no one but himself. He saw this career as a slim tower that might still hold through the term as planned, but would forever lack a foundational stone. And Leslie, in a small room rented with the last savings, drawing the city night deep into her lungs, realized she need not wait for anyone to name her to exist. She did not need Vernon's certification to exist within her own history, did not need the family's power to script the next act, but she also knew that to go on she had to guard against mutating into the dark version of herself she had threatened on the bleakest days. She stood before two doors, one leading down into the ravine of ruthless reprisal, the other onto a steep switchback of rebuilding, and she chose the latter. Peaches did not turn Leslie into a girl rescued by miracle, she held a small, durable role. She helped Leslie renegotiate with the oversight body to open a small account for the community education programs Leslie had started, using Barbara's notes to show the trust's original intent. She took Leslie to an attorney outside every ring around Anita or Vernon so meetings would not leak. She called a few old friends at church to get Leslie a part-time class to teach soft skills so she had a peg to hang mornings on. The pieces were modest to the point of taciturn, but precisely such pieces laced into a thin line long enough to pull Leslie through a second storm season. In a few weeks Leslie learned to read trust covenants the way one reads the sky for rain, learned not to react at the first mention of Anita's name, learned to watch hit pieces as trade winds unworthy of opening a window. She scheduled sessions with independent financial advisors outside the family to plan repayments on unsettled expenses, sent letters of apology to projects paused by locked cash flows, held on to a small crew of volunteers who were immune to surrounding noise, and began to see that if the loud pride of old days was gone, something quieter yet sturdier remained. Dawn runs along the river returned a breath she had not heard in a long time, each bead of sweat a portion of old anger pushed out. Meanwhile, what Leslie thought would be Anita's end proved only a bend. Anita stood firm in another sense, the sense of a person taking blows and not falling. She was isolated in certain circles once familiar, but she did not lose all. She kept capable staff, persuaded authorities that any past interference, if it occurred, was meant to keep the estate safe and steer clear of political tailspins. She accepted cold stares from once friends, accepted added accountability in committees, tightened procedures so not a sliver remained for accusation. She even visited a few of the education programs Leslie had built, not for a photo, but to remind herself the old aim still stood. In quiet spans between meetings she sometimes admitted she could have walked alongside Leslie with decency had she, at the start, spoken plainly about the price of the gift, the limits, and her own fear. Time does not rewind, it only places a person before a mirror to choose how to stand tomorrow. Later, supplementary testing with different markers and statistical modeling reinforced a likely biological tie between Vernon and Leslie. No one forced Vernon to say anything, but numbers tell their own stories, and even the flintier members of his team understood the truth might have been there all along, bent by self-preservation. Vernon chose to redeem a sliver of silence with a wordless act. He signed a waiver relinquishing any influence over oversight decisions regarding Leslie so that if concessions were made to projects she proposed, they would not be read as favors from his power. He also contributed anonymously to a scholarship fund Leslie and Peaches would eventually build, treating it as an apology in the idiom men like him favor, money routed correctly without a roll call. Leslie, reading the leaked memo, simply wrote thank you in her notebook and closed it, because she had decided earlier that her road could not be laid while looking back for an official nod. The story does not close with reunion or an embrace under the living room light. It closes on an ordinary afternoon as Leslie stands in the back lot of a community center watching children run, hearing shoes slap concrete, thinking of Barbara smiling somewhere, thinking of Peaches brewing a mintage tea, thinking of Anita reshuffling her calendar to be present at a bruising hearing, thinking of Vernon perhaps reading a long report with tired eyes. She no longer needs any of their names to validate where she belongs. She no longer needs galas to prove she fits. She knows precisely where she was wrong, where she went too far, where she weaponized pain into strikes, and she knows she will not surrender the right to speak truth when it is required. Anita will keep standing in her way, resilient enough to endure the barbed wire of aftermath and, perhaps on a far day, generous enough to place an apology in the soft register no one believes she owns. Leslie will not mutate into the unhinged or cruel caricature scattered across the press because she has touched bottom and understands one more step would preclude return. She has chosen and is walking on, with legs that have slipped but still hold. And at the story's edge, Peaches will always show up when needed with a canvas bag and a nod, the way one ties a rope around the waist before crossing flood season, without noise, without asking for payback, only because she once promised a woman named Barbara she would preserve for a girl named Leslie the right to know, the right to hurt, and the right to stand up by herself without anyone's surname for a crutch.